Renata Voss had spent 19 years building the invisible scaffolding that kept Halberd Dynamics upright. And on the Tuesday morning, she was fired. She was standing in the third-floor cafeteria, holding a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea, when Julian Croft climbed onto a stainless steel counter like a man auditioning for his own biopic. He pointed a manicured finger through the steam rising off the espresso machines, told the assembled interns and warehouse supervisors that the company was shedding legacy weight, and announced, with the theatrical cruelty of someone who had never once been told no, that Renata's employment was terminated as of that exact second. She didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't even set down her tea, because 19 years of navigating boardroom landmines had taught her that dignity was the only currency worth spending in a room full of people waiting to see her break. Instead, she reached into her cardigan pocket, produced the heavy brass ring that held keys to loading docks, server vaults, and a rooftop generator shed nobody else even knew existed, and pressed it into Julian's palm with a small, unreadable smile, watching his triumphant expression falter for just a heartbeat as the weight of the ring settled strangely heavy in his hand. What Julian did not know, and what none of the wide-eyed junior staff clutching their oat milk lattes understood either, was that Renata's real authority had never lived in that ring of brass at all, but in a decade-old stack of legal designations that made her the sole registered custodian of Halberd's federal compliance filings, vendor security clearances, and infrastructure liability contracts, a status granted to her years earlier by the company's founder, Dorian Halberd, back when the business ran out of a converted print shop and needed someone steady enough to sign her name to things that actually mattered. Julian, freshly installed as interim CEO, while his father recovered from a stress-induced cardiac scare in Portugal, had inherited a corner office and a company credit card, but he had never once bothered to read the founding documents that quietly named Renata the failsafe behind every system he now claimed to command. Renata drove home in silence that evening, parked in her narrow garage, and sat for a long while with her hands on the steering wheel before finally retrieving a battered green folder from beneath the spare tire in her trunk, a folder labeled simply Continuity in her own careful handwriting. Inside were the transition clauses, the vendor renewal schedules, and the biometric authorization records that made her, on paper and in practice, the last living thread connecting Halberd Dynamics to the outside institutions that kept it legally solvent. And as she flipped through page after page under her kitchen light, she realized with quiet astonishment that Julian had fired her without triggering a single one of the mandatory offboarding procedures required by law. By the following morning, the cracks had already begun to show, starting with the badge readers at the loading dock refusing to recognize any employee credential because the biometric override system had automatically frozen itself the instant Renata's authorization lapsed without a documented transfer. Julian, sweating through his blazer in the summer heat, screamed into his phone at the head of IT, a mild-mannered man named Desmond, who calmly explained that the entire security architecture had been built around a single, verified custodian, and that custodian, as it happened, was the woman Julian had just humiliated in front of the entire cafeteria staff less than 24 hours earlier. Within a week, the collapse had spread far beyond the doors, seeping into payroll systems that refused to release the biannual bonus disbursements because the secondary authorization token was tied to Renata's private key, and into vendor relationships that began evaporating one by one as suppliers received automated compliance alerts naming an unreachable custodian of record. A $300 million merger negotiation with a firm called Ashgrove Analytics stalled entirely when their legal team discovered that Halberd's entire cybersecurity certification rested on credentials belonging to someone no longer employed there, and their general counsel, a soft-spoken man named Preston Ashgrove, quietly reached out to Renata directly for clarification, rather than trusting a single word coming out of Julian's increasingly frantic press releases. Renata answered every question honestly and without a trace of malice, explaining plainly that she had been terminated without any transition protocol, that she retained no active access, and that she could not, in good conscience, vouch for the current state of systems she no longer had any legal responsibility to maintain. And 2 days later, Ashgrove Analytics formally withdrew from merger talks, citing unresolved custodial risk in a 2-line email that landed on Julian's desk like a guillotine blade. The board, blindsided and furious, convened an emergency session where the company's general counsel, a weary woman named Fiora Marsh, laid out in excruciating detail how a single impulsive firing had unraveled compliance frameworks tied to federal filings, insurance validity, and a dozen active vendor contracts, all because nobody had bothered to check what forgotten clause still bound Renata Voss to the very foundation of the building they occupied. Dorian Halberd himself flew home early from his recovery retreat, ashen-faced and disbelieving, and sat through a meeting where his own son was forced to admit, in front of the full board, that he had fired the one person legally required to authorize the company's continued operation, all over a desire to look decisive on his first week in charge. Julian tried to spin the disaster as an aggressive restructuring opportunity, but the numbers told a different story entirely, with 3 more clients quietly severing ties within days and the company's insurance carrier threatening to void coverage entirely unless a properly credentialed custodian was reinstated within 30 days, a deadline that felt, to everyone in that glass-walled boardroom, impossibly close. Meanwhile, across town in a modest office suite with her name freshly stenciled on frosted glass, Renata was quietly building something new, having accepted a consulting partnership from 2 former Halberd clients who reached out the moment word spread that she was no longer bound to her old employer's chaos. Her new venture, Voss Continuity Group, opened its doors with 3 signed contracts already on the books, including one from a company that had watched Halberd's public unraveling with the kind of wide-eyed fascination usually reserved for slow-motion car accidents. And by the end of her first week, she had hired 2 former colleagues who'd grown just as tired of being treated as replaceable furniture. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Renata received a call from Fiora Marsh, who explained in careful, measured tones that the board was prepared to offer her an extraordinary consulting fee if she would simply help them untangle the compliance mess before the insurance deadline expired. And Renata, feeling no bitterness but plenty of calm satisfaction, agreed to a single meeting purely on her own terms and her own hourly rate. She walked back into the Halberd Dynamics lobby exactly as she always had, unhurried and unbothered, past a receptionist who nearly dropped her coffee at the sight of her, and delivered a single folder to the boardroom table containing a full transition plan, watching quietly as Julian, now visibly diminished, sat in stunned silence at the far end of the table, where the founder's chair used to be his alone to command. The final image anyone at Halberd Dynamics would remember of that entire saga was Renata setting down her pen after signing the formal, properly documented transition agreement, shaking Dorian's hand with genuine warmth, and walking out through the same lobby doors she'd exited in disgrace weeks earlier, except this time every single person in that building understood exactly who had been holding the whole structure together the entire time. She never raised her voice, never leaked a document, never once acted out of spite. And yet the quiet, patient truth of who she really was had done more damage to Julian's ego and Halberd's bottom line than any dramatic act of sabotage ever could have, proving that the people who keep the lights on rarely need to shout to be remembered. If this story hit you right in the chest the way it did for us while we were writing it, we'd love for you to stick around for more, because there are so many more tales of quiet, patient justice, just like Renata's waiting to be told. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.